Hello there, Enver here, and I wanted to make a video about a very important topic. This is something I've debated a lot of leftists about, and that's why I wanted to make a video about this. It's a very broad issue, so I'm sorry if there's a lot I couldn't cover in this video, because I just wanted to have a brief overview of my thoughts. And I also wanted just to be able to talk about this because of how many misconceptions there are. Basically, what I wanted to talk about was the law of value and revolution. And naturally, that has a lot of implications. What this cuts to the heart of, though, is what our goal should be as leftists and what we should even be trying to do to abolish capitalism. And yes, for the record, I do believe as leftists that is our primary goal here, our primary whole shebang is to deal with capitalism, deal with this economic system, this system of power, and a lot of things tie up in that. So I'm very much opposed to identity politics, but the abolishment of capitalism, dealing with capitalism, cuts to the heart of a bunch of other issues like racism and sexism and a lot of those things because of how it interplays with power more generally. But that's for another video, I think. First of all, what exactly is the law of value? This guy, Capitalism 101, that's the name of his YouTube channel, made a great video series about this topic, even though his own personal politics are pretty dumb, and he should feel bad about them. But regardless, he knows, he understands the law of value at least, and he explains it very well. To summarize, though, the law of value has a couple of consequences that are very important. These are consequences basically of exchanging commodities from a Marxist standpoint. You have this cycle of taking money, turning it into commodities to get more money, then you repeat the cycle over and over again. And this is at the basis of capital accumulation. What we see that the law of value does in the real world is that besides capital accumulation, it also causes consolidation of businesses. You keep seeing like larger and larger conglomerations, more mergers, all these kinds of things. You don't see a small business taking over assets of a larger business, let's put it that way. What you see is larger businesses taking control of assets of smaller businesses. This is something that's been going on since capitalism started, and it's not going to stop. It's a very important feature of it. On a somewhat related note, the law of value also entails a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. This means that in the long run, the competition of getting more and more capital, more and more automation to increase productivity and thus increase profits in the short term actually leads to less profits in the longer run because of how the competition undercuts prices and that sort of thing. On a more general level, because these things mean less competition, more inequality, lots of income and wealth disparity, this can sound like a pretty bad thing, right? Well, it is, especially if you want to preserve capitalism. Left to its own devices, as Marx pointed out all those years ago, if consolidation was allowed to completely monopolize markets and such, and we would be left with only a handful of business running most of everything, while at the same time income inequality is just increasing. The sheer power of the capitalist class and the desolation of the working class, which at this point would have no bargaining power and no purchasing power really either. And in capitalism, those are really the only two kinds of power that matter. Well, besides, military power. Marx believed that this situation, but especially the fact that by monopolizing so much of industry that competition becomes superfluous, the capitalists themselves become superfluous, that people would see that they don't need these guys anymore. They can take over, they can take control of these already socialized means of production. By that I mean that Whereas before you had a bunch of individual, atomized producers that were making all of these things and selling the market stuff. The ideal Adam Smith picture of capitalism. You now had a situation where everybody had to work together to produce for the needs of society. The capitalists would naturally lead to this point. In this sense, consolidation and monopolization of industry was at the heart of Marxist theory of how capitalism would destroy itself, and at the same time provide a situation where the industry, the means of production, would be capable of providing so much for everybody. Because these same market mechanisms and these same organizations of capitalism, of production, basically, it would create a very efficient way of distributing and producing goods for everyone. Even if those industries and productive forces were not being put towards their fullest capabilities because of the logic itself of capitalism, of how people need money to buy things. Because of exchange value, basically, things were being produced to get money, to make more commodities, to make more money, as opposed to producing for the actual needs and demands of people. As at this point, most of the money would be in the hands of the capitalists themselves. Most of the productive forces would be going towards meeting not just their needs, but their wants, their whims, that kind of thing. Yachts and child prostitutes and fine wines. I don't know what they really do. I'm assuming there's lots of drugs and sex involved. Maybe with the odd garden party or Martha Vineyard's vacation thrown in. Anyway, why hasn't this happened yet? Well, a certain portion of it has happened. We have seen this enormous capital accumulation. We've seen this enormous inequality and disparities. But we haven't quite seen this consolidation, this monopolization of industry to the level that Marx and Engels seem to describe. Well, the answer is very simple. We have antitrust laws. Well, they're called that in America. Elsewhere, they're called competition laws. And right after Marx died, around the 1890s, these were created. And unlike previous competition laws, or what had been their common law equivalents in England, these prevented mergers and consolidation themselves, whereas previously that never happened. Why did this happen, though? Well, it was because of the state. The state is presupposing private property as a part of what makes it up. It needs private property to exist. It's a contradictory kind of thing when you think about it in the ways of taxes and stuff, but the capitalist state needs it. It is also, to protect it, it sometimes protects capitalism from itself by mediating class conflicts. In this case, in the United States at that time, and in the early 20th century, there was this massive populist movement against the giant trusts, Standard Oil, Western Union, all the big companies that monopolized and consolidated all of this industry. Because the situation, like Marx described, was very intolerable. It wasn't nice to workers. It was just very beneficial to the capitalist and to their business. So naturally, instead of letting this come to a revolution, the state said, well, I better do something about this. And it instituted antitrust laws. We have people might remember from the previous campaign this last year about Bernie Sanders talking about Teddy Roosevelt, the big trust buster. This is what he was talking about. But by doing this, it shut down this process of the law of value. And this isn't something new. The state has been doing this for a long time. It resets basically the law of value. It resets capitalism by destroying. It does two things, right? For one, it increases competition at home while destroying competition abroad. It has to balance these countervailing forces of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and at the same time, consolidation. By destroying its foreign competition, like I mentioned in the last video, the British destroying the Indian cotton industry, they forgive that boost to profits at home. But in order to keep its own workers happy, it needs to keep the situation competitive. It needs to decrease the bargaining power of the capitalists and at the same time increase the purchasing power of the workers. And if you've ever taken like a college intermediate or even a basic economics course, they tell you about how monopolies take more of the surplus. This is the neoclassical version of surplus. It's dumb, but more of the surplus in the purchasing, in the selling of goods, as opposed to the buyers getting more of the surplus. All right, but why is this so important? Well, Marx thought that the law of value would reach its own natural end, and in doing so would create the socialization of the means of production that would pave the way for communism. This is basically what he says in chapter 32 of Das Kapital Volume 1. I think I'm actually going to quote him here because he puts it very, very well at what I'm talking about here. He says, "The monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of means of production, and socialization of labor at last reach a point where they can become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated." I don't think that Marx could have seen coming, though, antitrust and competition laws in the form that we have them today. He certainly expected things to turn out into, well, imagine if we didn't have them. Imagine the monopolies that would occur. That's what he imagined too. So, where does this leave us? I want to kind of shift gears a bit and talk about Slavoj Zizek likes to talk about. And this is, I should start where he starts. He brings up the movie V for Vendetta. And it's a very popular movie, you've probably seen it. If you haven't, it's about this guy who basically overthrows the British government, which at this point has become very despotic and stuff, right? And it's a great flick. But don't get ahead of me. I'm not going to go into a full literary analysis here, although I'm pretty sure Zizek has at some point. He likes to bring this movie up to ask a very uncomfortable question for the left. The movie ends with the very despotic government being destroyed by the people. Like, the mass of people coming up, rising up, taking control with, a little bit of help from the main characters, right? Here's where Zizek interjects. He says, "But what about the day after?" That's a terrible Zizek impression. I hope if anybody sees me in person, remembers that, slap me. But what about the day after? What happens once the despotic government has been overturned? What happens after capitalism, or at least the capitalist states, have been taken control of by the workers? This poses a very prickly issue for the radical left, as we've seemingly been without this kind of vision for the day after ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, certainly there have been some libertarian socialist anarchists who probably persevered through that, but as a mass movement, that's kind of been the effect. To some, it had become as though capitalism was the end of history, to speak in Hegelian terms for a moment. That was the idea put forth by this guy named Fukuyama, who's an idiot. That was in the 90s and early 2000s, so let's fast forward a bit to today, 2017, 100 years after the Bolshevik Revolution. Well, socialist movements are making something of a comeback in the West, and, well, we've got to reckon with this now. Capitalism is back on the chopping block, and we got to say what we're going to make, what kind of stew we're going to make from it, right? Well, to begin tackling this issue, so to speak, I want to bring up two very important facts that have been brought forth by alternatively liberal scholars and Marx. And by liberal scholars here, I mean Rousseau and Machiavelli, the original founding members of the school of liberalism. Revolutions in of themselves are not all-encompassing reorganizations of society, nor is the revolutionary forces permanently put in control unless this is some kind of monarchical revolution, right? Instead, what tends to happen is that the revolution creates a framework for this new society. For liberals, this mostly meant a legal and political framework. When I talk about the framework, though, I think I'd also like to include general power dynamics among classes. So let's include that. For Marx, revolutions are produced first and foremost by the underlying material relations of society. Capitalism was kind of already picking up steam by the time of the capitalist revolutions that overthrew the political and legal frameworks of feudalism, allowing capitalism to fully burst forth and become what it is today. And by these revolutions, we're talking about the French Revolution, we're talking about Cromwell and the Glorious Revolution, and there was all kinds of parallel revolutions in states across the world where capitalism came forth from feudalism. Alternatively, capitalism was introduced to countries and nations and stuff through colonialism and imperialism, and very violently usually. And when I say introduced, I mean like literally they had to force people to engage in markets and stuff, okay? But what Marx further tells us is that it's not the revolutionaries that, and it's not just Marx that says it actually, a general historical and economic analysis, I think, would point us this way. That is, that it is not the revolution or the revolutionaries that negate capitalism or build socialism. Rather, it is the place of the revolution to eliminate the legal and political framework that perpetuates capitalism and institute a new one that, one, allows the complete socialization and monopolization of production, and undo what the previous status quo states have been doing, which is not to mediate class conflict, but to provide a clear path forward into something better beyond private property. And two, to create a dictatorship of the proletariat. And now, when I'm talking about a dictatorship of the proletariat, I like to reference Rosa Luxemburg, because she puts it very clearly. I'm just paraphrasing here, but the dictatorship of the proletariat is a dictatorship of the entire class through unlimited democracy. And it's not a dictatorship of a party, of an elite, of a bureaucracy. It's a dictatorship of class. And when the proletariat is pretty much everyone, when it's when the capitalists as a place in society have been eliminated, it is democracy in the fullest and most true terms. As for Marx's earlier observations, I think it kind of goes to show that the conditions for revolution are already here. There is this massive disparity of wealth, and Slavoj Žižek, who I cited earlier, he likes to bring up how revolutions are more caused by changes in relative changes in conditions for people, for the mass of people. So, and we're kind of seeing that. We kind of saw that just recently with the crisis, and now people are taking on much more debt. There's a whole millennials especially have this big problem, and they're the most skeptical of capitalism to date. But we're also seeing that wages aren't really improving, even though we have there's just so much money that exists in the hands of a small amount of people. And I mentioned this also in my last video of how people don't really have this control over their own countries, over their own states, because of the way that capital flow works in the world. Capital can go anywhere. If you do anything that spooks capital markets, the policy isn't going to happen. And so we have this kind of impotence on the part of so many people, and they feel like Washington here in the U.S., they're not hearing us. And they're not. It's true. They don't, or at least they try to pretend they're hearing, but their hands are tied. They can't do anything. Capitalism has their hands tied, is what it is. Although I should add, not just capitalism. Ideology plays a big part in this. Free market ideology, nationalist ideologies, all kinds of ideology that, and Žižek would probably be able to talk about this at length, but I really can't because I'm not a psychoanalyst or anything. But it doesn't take a psychoanalyst to tell you that there's a lot of people in Washington, a lot of people around the country are spooked AF, so I'll leave that at that. But anyway, to bring together two threads of this video, in order for the law of value to reach its conclusion, in order for this socialization of the means of production to occur, you really need a dictatorship of the proletariat. You need to have workers in control. And what this means isn't just a political context, because the political context is produced by a lot of things. It's produced by the media, the mass media, by the economic powers that be, all that kind of thing. So it includes, for one, the end of profit news, the beginning of non-profit news, and we need to have that set. And furthermore, it means the cooperatization of industry. It means we're putting workers in control of their workplace. It is only through the situation of complete proletarian control, and thus democracy, that this can only happen through the elimination of all methods of bourgeoisie control. So that's why I'm talking about, the media, economic industry, and there's probably a few other things, but those are the big ones, right? It's only in this situation, when socialization of the means of production is directly in the interests of workers, and it's within their control to make this consolidation happen, that you're going to see it happen. Now, it's important to note that this is still technically capitalism. The dictatorship of the proletariat is capitalism. And even although Marx described the dictatorship of the proletariat as a necessary step to reach communism, socialism, and all that, I think it's important to note that it's only through this negation. Marx calls it the negation of the negation because private property, capitalism is already negating the economic and political situation of feudalism. So this is negating capitalism negating itself, basically. And he does describe it as such, as capitalism that negates itself. It's not the revolutionaries that negate it. The revolutionaries, according to him, they were only supposed to come into control after capitalism negated itself, and the situation would have been terrible. But obviously we can't even get to that point now because of the role of the state preventing consolidation and preventing all of these forces of the law of value from being fully drawn through. The reason I'm talking about this in the first place, like I mentioned, is because it gets brought up in debate a lot. In particular, there's one video of the law of value video series that gets thrown at me that, we can't have any of these things if we want to think of a true alternative. And so, no, listen to me. Listen. If we want a true alternative, we have to start with a negation. People will create their alternative. The alternative will be born naturally about whatever's created. Certainly you can have programs and kinds of things that get people motivated and stuff. And those kind of political things are part of the own natural part of this. You can't escape them. And even if, when we talk about the abolishing of capitalism, that entails a whole bunch of things like wage labor, commodity production, all kinds of things. And those things are going to go away not by revolutionaries making them go away. They're going to go away by people, the workers in particular, coming together and figuring out how they're going to do things, how they're going to get things done. And up to a certain point, it's going to happen through natural forces like the law of value, at least up until it fulfills that negation, right? What I see a lot, though, is that many radical leftists, ultra-leftists and left-coms especially, they're the worst, often forget this moment of negation. They'll criticize anything that isn't saying, we need to immediately abolish these X, Y, and Z. Well, no, it's not the revolutionaries' job to abolish these things. It's it'll happen because the working class will make it happen, because they're going to figure these things out for themselves. All we have to do, all of what our responsibility is in the context of a revolution, is the responsibility to create a framework for this to happen, a framework where we can move beyond the choices that capitalism has imposed upon us, basically. At the same time, there's other people who forget that revolutions This is connected to what I was saying earlier, but revolutions don't build new societies. The dynamics of these new societies already exist. They already existed for capitalism. They'll already exist for communism, that kind of thing. Um, but revolutions don't just create them. They make these dynamics be allowed to break free and provide a framework for their development. Okay? So one more final note about revolutions. I use that word a lot in this video. I don't want to get flagged as, or reported as inspiring terrorism or anything. And it's important to note that Marx, in particular, talked about how the revolution to communism from capitalism would be a lot easier than the revolution from feudalism to capitalism, because that involved a very small number of people consolidating power from the many and through primitive accumulation. And he also, even during one of his speeches to the Working Men's Association, aka the First Internationale, he described how it was possible to have a nonviolent revolution when you had universal suffrage like we do now in many countries. The reason that even though we have we have the right conditions here for revolution, even maybe a non-violent revolution, I really hope so, I think so. We have to understand what's going on here. We have to, I know some people like to dismiss class consciousness, but it is important. And it's not gonna, if you don't show people that or at least give people hope that there's an alternative, that there is this day after the revolution, or at the very least you can say that you are in control of your own society, that you can have whatever, you can have an X, Y, and Z of a political program, you can have universal health care, you can have food for everyone, you can have housing for everyone. We have the resources, they're here. There's more houses here than there are people, but they're still homeless. We just have to put two and two together here. We need to give people this concrete alternative, and you can put forth your little plan, your manifesto of what tomorrow's kitchen or soup kitchen will look like. And Mark's really talked down about that and stuff. Cockshot, I think, does something like that. He presented a viable alternative. And I think there's some good critiques of it, mostly political critiques, but still, good on him. The point of these kind of things, the point of these exercises, is not to create, or at least it should not be, this grand plan of how we're gonna get from here to there, and we're gonna it's how we're gonna restructure society in infinitesimal detail. People should acknowledge that that's not our goal. At least you can say that this is a hypothetical solution. I think that's what we should be doing. I think we should be putting forth hypothetical solutions. But preface, we can do. The point is not that this is exactly what we're going to do. The point is that we're going to take power for ourselves. We're going to have self-ownership. We're going to have ownership over the world around us, and just get some sense into this nonsense that is capitalism. But just for your information, here's one way that we could do things, just to show that it's not impossible. And that's my thoughts on that. On a related note, looking through my checklist, there's a lot of contentions about markets and states in the post-revolutionary society. My personal belief: if you have a state, you need markets. If you have a market, you need states. Historically, we've seen that. If you want to get rid of them, you have to create a framework, create a situation where they will destroy each other. And I think that you can create a situation like that for the dictatorship of the proletariat. For example, we're talking about consolidation. You create some kind of fund, for example, that when a firm has increasing market share, they become more and more publicly owned by this fund is a publicly owned fund. It's not a state fund. That's important. It is just owned by the people writ large, and that fund will eventually, once consolidation goes close to 100%, it'll be in charge of most production to get most people what they need. And it won't be a state, and won't be a market, at least not capital markets or factor markets, but perhaps a forward customer-facing market. But that's just an example. This is the kind of exercise that I'm talking about. But it's important not to forget what we're talking about, what our goals are, what we're trying to that our first and foremost goal is to negate and to get people in power, to get the masses in power, to have real democracy. That should be the first number one thing we should be worried about right now. And look at what people want. Look, people want universal health care in the U.S. right now. You gotta fight for these kind of things. Fight for 15. That's something. This is what the working class is doing right now. And you have to mobilize them. You have to get involved in that kind of stuff. Get involved in organizations and stuff. And theory is important, but I hate to say this because people will hate me for it, but theory is not praxis. That's an idealist thing. And I'll make another video about this. Lots of lists of videos to make. So that's one. Another is about states and markets. Another one is just a general intro video that I still have to make for the channel, Just explain who I am, what I want. I would really love to debate people. That's what I really want, debate people about this topic. Improve my debating skills, because they're not the best. If left to my own devices, I tend to ramble a lot. Maybe you've noticed that already. But that is a problem I have, and I need to get that under control. Another note, on the last video, I mispronounced Hoja, because I'm a dirty burger from America, and I will not do that in the future. Well, thank you all. One last update about Spectre Rose. I have gotten good advice to postpone the release to October, so that it coincides with the 100-year anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. I think that would be very fitting, and I'm already getting a lot of articles for it, and I think it will be very nice. So I hope you all look forward to that. Anyway, see you later. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. I'm pretty sure that there's plenty of places where you can prove I'm an idiot somewhere along here. Leave it in the comments. I look forward to reading it.